The commodification of women by influential men has a long, tragic history in India. From practically the beginning of urban settlements in the 5th century BCE, literary sources mention the presence of enslaved women in our country. And well into the 19th century, until British colonial laws were enforced across South Asia, a vast body of evidence indicates that elites participated in the trafficking of women. Contemporary attitudes often have deep historical roots, deeper than we might think. One of the earliest mentions of enslaved women comes from the Antagada Dasau, an early Jain text dating to around the 5th century BC, when kingdoms were emerging across the Gangetic plains. It depicts a prince as being attended to by Persian and Greek women, as well as many local women. India had no direct links with Greece at the time. The presence of Greek women in such an early text may indicate that they were slaves trafficked through Persia, at the time the world's mightiest empire. Adding heft to this theory are roughly contemporary claims by the Greek historian Herodotus. As historian Kathryn A. Hain points out in her paper The Prestige Makers, Greek Slave Women in Ancient India, Herodotus claims that ravaging Persian raids captured Greek women for slavery and sale. In subsequent centuries, early Indian rulers prided themselves on having large numbers of women attendants, an attitude that was fairly commonplace in the pre-modern world. Having foreign women in court demonstrated a king's reach and wealth to his rivals and subjects. Foreign women could also fill roles that Indian women were socially or culturally restricted from, such as bodyguard duty. The Mauryan kings, for example, were protected by bow-wielding Greek women who, as Hain points out, might even protect the king from his own queens. And a large number of Sanskrit sources well into the 3rd century CE mention Yavanis, or women from the Mediterranean, in this role, but they are also described, flushed with imported Western wine, as courtesans and sex workers. Some women were also trafficked from the African coast and referred to as barbari. Roman historians and trade documents support these literary claims, indicating that enslaved women taken to India brought considerable tariff income to their state. India's trading contacts with the Mediterranean waned somewhat in the 4th century CE, and at the same time, a new model of Indian kingship was emerging which intertwined virility, martial success, and control over women. Over the next 1,000 years, Indian kings commissioned Sanskrit language eulogies declaring their success in all these fields. Martial conquest was often presented as a sexual conquest, with the goddesses of fortune, earth, and the 4 directions represented as beautiful women. For example, the 7th century Chalukya king Vikramaditya I attacked the city of Kanchi to his south. Then, in the overblown language of his time, he claimed to have, and I quote, joyfully enjoyed the lady of the southern quarters after subduing her through force and taking possession of Kanchi, her girdle. You can see the inscription on your screen. A little more than a century later, King Krishna I of the Rashtrakuta Empire defeated the Chalukya family and claimed in turn that he, and I quote, in the battlefield which proved a place of choice marriage, he forcibly wrested away the fortune of the Chalukya family. Such attitudes were prevalent across South Asia. Even the famous Chola dynasty, for example, mentioned the mutilation and capture of rival queens and their absorption into palace service retinues. And violence wasn't confined to elite women either. Medieval hero stones, which marked valiant deaths in villages, frequently record that women were abducted or about to be abducted until rescued by a now dead hero. This must also indicate that many more women were actually abducted without being rescued. The situation grew even worse in the late medieval period when sultanates across northern India connected the Gangetic plains to Persia and Central Asia, which relied on slave labor. From sultans to minor landlords, many men participated in the trafficking of enslaved people. A 13th century Sanskrit text from Gujarat, the Lekha Paddhati, provides examples of a certain Rana Pratapa Singha and Sri Veeradhavaladeva, a Rajaputra, who captured 16-year-old girls in raids and then sold them into lives of cruel oppression. And multiple texts attest to the presence of slave markets in Delhi and other major cities. Even as far as Syria and Egypt, contemporaries wrote approvingly of enslaved Indian women, both Hindu and Muslim. The number of trafficked people is difficult to verify. As historian Shadab Bano writes in India's Overland Slave Trade in the Medieval Period, 14th century travelers thought the name of the Hindu Kush mountains was derived from the death of thousands of enslaved Indians who passed through them. It's possible that this is an oral legend, but it still indicates the very real scale of the slave trade. And many of these trafficked people were poor and landless, captured in wars and raids before being packed off to miserable deaths in the cold. Even as Indian women were sold off, Central Asian, Turkic, and Caucasian women were purchased. Many late medieval kings had foreign ladies in their palaces as palanquin bearers and bodyguards. These palace establishments were also home to hundreds of Indian slave women. It was only in the 16th century that the Mughal Emperor Akbar finally banned the slave trade, but this still didn't stop the practice. In fact, as Professor Bano points out in another paper, Women Slaves in Medieval India, there's documentary evidence that some Mughal officials captured women in raids and even used them to pay their soldiers' salaries. And as late as the 19th century, British officers such as Francis Buchanan and John Malcolm found that zamindars and Rajputs in central and east India still owned large numbers of enslaved women. In recent years, medieval Indian queens have at last begun to get their due. Mughal historian Ruby Lal, in her biography of Noor Jahan, writes that the 17th century Empress freed slave women in her palace and made arrangements to support working class women. And we've also seen in early editions of Thinking Medieval like this one that queens could rule kingdoms and order wars. But at the same time, if the men of their families were defeated, the bodies of their queens were on the line, targeted by enemies. So even though some women, thanks to their birth and wealth and perhaps their caste position, were able to wield power, the majority could not. In the absence of constitutional protocols and understanding that all people are equal, pre-modern women were frequently subject to violence, objectification, and slavery. And even royal status is only a partial remedy to that. We can't talk about queens without accepting that pre-modern Indian societies were difficult places for women, and this laid the base for our contemporary attitudes. So, where does this leave us today? I don't want to suggest that misogyny is so ingrained in our past that we can't overcome it. After all, pre-modern Indians existed in a world where the oppression of women was routine. But many societies that India once traded with have created safe, respectful working environments for women. Europe was once home to the Roman Empire, an economy based almost entirely on slave labor and which exported slaves to India, but it consistently ranks high on equality and safety indicators. There's still a long way to go, but acknowledging our troubled history is a necessary first step. I'm sure this is a controversial opinion, so if you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.